Everyone agreed on the result. The numbers were clean. The report was signed. The diagnosis made sense. I nodded like everyone else, standing near the workstation in my simple light blue hospital uniform, my short dark brown wavy hair probably showing the tiredness I felt at 52 years old after countless night shifts just like this one. In places like that, agreement is comforting. It keeps things moving. It keeps the night quiet. But something about it felt wrong, and I couldn't explain why. Not yet. I've worked in hospitals long enough to understand how decisions are made. Most of them aren't dramatic. They're built on routines, on experience, on patterns that usually work. That night was full of those patterns. The ward was crowded, beds were filled, phones rang constantly at the desk. Doctors moved quickly from room to room, doing what they always do. Nothing looked careless, nothing felt rushed in a dangerous way. If anything, it felt efficient. Everything looked normal. That's why no one questioned the result. My role that night was organizing files, keeping records in order, making sure nothing went missing. I wasn't part of the discussion. No one asked for my input. They didn't need to. The test came back just before midnight. I remember the sound of the printer before I remember the numbers. One of the doctors picked up the page. Dr. Harrison, confident as always, 40-something with graying temples and the kind of posture that came from years of being right. He skimmed it once, then again, slower. He read the result out loud. Another doctor nodded without looking up. Someone else typed the next steps into the system. No one argued, no one hesitated. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that the result fit perfectly into what they already believed. It matched the symptoms everyone had noticed earlier. That was the assumption, that the symptom explained the result, that the result explained the situation. It was reasonable, and that's what made it dangerous. I stayed near the workstation, my white skin probably looking pale under the fluorescent lights, my careful, observant eyes moving between the screen and the printed report. Still, my eyes kept going back to the report, not because I saw a mistake, not because I disagreed with anyone, but because something didn't settle the way it should have. I couldn't point to a problem, I could only feel a gap, like a sentence that ends too neatly. I told myself it was nothing. Hospitals teach you that not every doubt deserves a voice. Sometimes doubt is just fatigue. So I kept working. A few minutes later, I checked the timestamp again, my contained demeanor never changing even as the discomfort grew. Then the notes from earlier that day. Then the intake form. Everything was correct. Dates matched, names matched, values were where they should be, individually, but together they told a story that felt incomplete. The timing felt off. The order of events didn't match the conclusion everyone had already accepted. I tried to ignore it. Everyone else had moved on. Beds needed to be reassigned, other patients needed attention. This case was already considered settled, so I stayed quiet, reviewing clinical data the way I always did, my short, wavy, dark brown hair tucked behind my ears as I leaned closer to the monitor. Time passed the way it always does during a night shift, slowly, unevenly. Just after 1 a.m, the second scan came back. There was no urgency attached to it, no alarms, no calls over the intercom, just another update in the system. Dr. Harrison opened the file while standing, his confident posture unchanged. He read the first line without reacting, then the second, then he stopped talking mid-sentence. No one noticed at first. The room didn't change immediately, but silence has weight in places like that. Someone leaned closer to the screen. Another person asked for the chart again, more carefully this time. No one used the word mistake. They didn't need to. The numbers were still correct. The test wasn't wrong. But now, placed next to the new information, it meant something else entirely. The conclusion everyone had agreed on no longer held, not because anyone was careless, because the context had been incomplete. No one spoke for a moment, not because they were shocked, but because they were recalculating everything they thought they understood. That quiet felt heavier than any argument. I stood there in my light blue uniform, my observant 52-year-old face showing nothing, but inside I felt the weight of that unspoken recognition. The gap I'd felt earlier wasn't nothing. It had been real. The plan changed, not dramatically, not publicly. Orders were adjusted, notes were rewritten, new steps were entered into the system. The shift continued. If you were walking through the ward, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. No raised voices, no apologies. But something important had shifted. Understanding. As things settled, Dr. Harrison glanced in my direction, just for a second. There was no explanation in his eyes, no defense, just recognition. Not of me, but of the oversight. That was enough. Most mistakes aren't loud. They're quiet. They're reasonable. They feel safe until they don't. And the people who catch them aren't always the ones with authority. Sometimes they're the ones who've been there long enough to recognize when a pattern doesn't fit, when a conclusion comes too easily, when agreement is comforting but incomplete. I'm 52 years old. I wear a light blue hospital uniform. I review clinical data. I organize files. I notice gaps, and sometimes that's enough. The next shift, Dr. Harrison nodded at me when I came in. Just a small acknowledgement, nothing more, but it was different than before. He saw me now, not as the woman who organized files, but as someone who noticed things, someone whose observations mattered, even when they came without credentials or authority. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need recognition. I just needed to know that the gap I'd felt had been valid, that my instinct to keep checking had been right. Most mistakes aren't loud. They're quiet. They're reasonable. They feel safe until they don't. And the people who catch them aren't always the ones with authority. Sometimes they're the ones who've been there long enough to recognize when a pattern doesn't fit, when a conclusion comes too easily, when agreement is comforting but incomplete. I'm 52 years old. I wear a light blue hospital uniform. I review clinical data. I organize files. I notice gaps. And sometimes that's enough.